Hello, Professor Newmeyer. Hello, Fritz. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us, at least in this form. I'm so sorry you cannot be here with us. We all regret that very much. Anyway, let us go on with this plenary lecture, very special plenary lecture, which is open to the city as well. So we also have guests from outside of the university and outside of academia. So welcome to everybody to this talk by Professor Frederick Newmeyer. The title of the talk, Can One Language Be More Complex Than Another? But before I ask Professor Newmeyer to take the floor, I would like to say just a few words about our speaker. Professor Frederick Newmeyer is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the University of Washington. And at the same time, he's also professor in the University of British Columbia in the Department of Linguistics and the Simon Fraser University Department of Linguistics. His work has had a profound influence on the field of theoretical linguistics. Especially, he's been recognized for his contributions to generative grammar and the study of relationship between syntax and linguistic typology. His research has shaped how linguists think about the relationships between universal grammar and cross-linguistic variation, and his contributions have been critical in shaping debates about formalism and functionalism in linguistics. Some of his notable works selected from his vast research include grammatical theory, its limits and its possibilities, the politics of linguistics, possible and probable languages, a generative perspective on linguistic typology, and also, and which very much connects to today's topic, measuring grammatical complexity. Today, Professor Newmeyer is going to address one of the most important, most central, and most controversial issues in linguistics. Can one language be more complex than another? Professor Newmeyer, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I would also like to thank all of the officers and the scientific committee of SIPL and the local organizing committee as well here in Poznań for their kind invitation, and especially for their allowing me to present this talk remotely. I really appreciate it. For many years, textbooks have been telling the students of linguistics that all languages are equally complex. Just look at a few textbooks. The best-selling textbook in history, Fromkin and Rodman, there are no primitive languages. All languages are equally complex and equally capable of expressing any idea in the universe. Another one, contrary to popular belief, all languages have grammars that are roughly equal in complexity. One more. Although it is obvious that specific languages differ from each other, on the surface, if we look closer, we find that human languages are at a similar level of complexity and detail. There's no such thing as a primitive language. Those three books have somewhat generative orientations, but not just generative grammarians claim this. Bob Dixon, a great typologist, it's a finding of modern linguistics that all languages are roughly equal in terms of overall complexity. The leading sociolinguist, Peter Trudgill, it appears to linguists that all languages are equally complex and structured. I have to say, and you all know, that equal complexity is not popular opinion. The 1956 edition of the Guinness Book of World Records, quote unquote, identified the world's quote unquote most primitive language. The choice was the Australian language Arunta, in which words are indeterminate in form and meaning. When Dixon described his fieldwork on these languages, a journalist replied, "You mean the Aborigines have a language?" I thought it was just a few grunts and groans. And I have to say that is a fairly popular opinion. Where does this idea come from, that all languages are equally complex? A lot of linguists would reply Edward Sapir, and there's a very, very famous quote by Sapir. When it comes to linguistic form, Plato walks with the Macedonian swineherd, and Confucius with the headhunting savage of Assam. People don't say savage anymore, thankfully. But he wasn't saying that all languages are equally complex. Look at the sentence before that. Both simple and complex types of languages may be found spoken at any desired level of cultural advance. Sapir did not believe that all languages are equally complex. The first explicitly published claim I know for equal complexity dates only from 1954. Rulon Wells, an American philosopher and linguist, wrote, again, one can isolate the complexity of a language in phonemics, etc., but these properties hang together in such a way that the total complexity of a language is approximately the same for all languages. In a footnote, Wells credits the idea to something Charles Hockett wrote a couple years earlier. A few years later, the idea of equal complexity made it into the Encyclopedia Britannica in an entry written by George Traeger, quote, and this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, all languages of today are equally complex and equally adequate to express all of the facets of the speaker's culture. So by the 1950s, 1960s, it seems that the great majority of linguists in the world believe this. All languages are equally complex. But why? Why have most linguists believed this? There are three reasons. First, humanism. The idea is that since all human groups are equal in a certain way, their languages must be equal too. Secondly, language use, the idea that complexity in one area will always be balanced out by simplicity in another. And third, just looking at linguistic theory, not only generative theory, but other theories too, the nature of universal grammar demands that all languages be equally complex. We'll look at these reasons one by one. Take humanism. Again, since language is the most central human cognitive faculty, to claim that human languages can differ in complexity, that would be like claiming that human populations can differ in terms of their cognitive abilities. David Gill put it in a way that I think is very, very precise. David Gill wrote, some people seem to think that if one language were be shown to be more complex than another, then it would follow that the latter language in some sense is inferior, which in turn would entail that the speakers of that language are inferior. And from here, we're only one step short to ethnic cleansing. Perhaps a little extreme, but certainly many linguists feel this way. I sympathize with a humanistic argument, but I feel that it's flawed. Any child can learn any language. Everybody knows that, whether it's simple or complex. So even if there were such a thing as a simple grammar, that does not imply that there would be a simple mind. Also, most discussions about complexity focus on morphology. What might a simple versus a complex morphology reveal about cognition? Probably nothing. So I'm going to pass by the humanistic argument and look what might be the strongest argument for equal complexity, the constraining effects of language use. The idea is that language use ensures that language change be a series of trade-offs keeping overall complexity in balance. This is a very, very old idea. In the 19th century, William Dwight Whitney talked about the means of formal expression are very various, but deficiency in one department, and by department he meant what we would call a grammatical component, might be compensated for by resources in another. In other words, one part of the grammar balances the other part of the grammar. Complexity stays the same. Around the same time, Georg von der Gabelentz contrasted two opposing drives. The speaker wants comfort, Bequemlichkeit, ease of production. The hearer wants clarity, Deutlichkeit, ease of perception. For Gabelentz, the demands of successful communication guarantee that grammatical systems can never stray too far on behalf of one of these drives at the expense of the other. There's always equal complexity from language to language. And there are many, many examples of trade-offs between simplicity in one part of the grammar and complexity in another part. Anna Siewierska had written many times, case marking tends to correlate with flexible word order. So most Indo-European languages have lost much case marking, but have developed more rigid order. This again is a very old idea that goes back to the 19th century. James Matisoff pointed out that complex syllable structure often correlates with low tonal complexity. Tone languages tend to have similar simple syllable structure. Languages that are spoken fast tend to pack less information into each individual syllable. So information rates tend to be similar from language to language. A very interesting French study. Dan Everett claims that Piraha, very famous case, lacks recursion, it lacks quantifiers, numbers, color terms, and much more. Much debate about this question, but for Everett, at least in some cases, the Piraha can still express the concepts encoded by these devices via more complex phraseology. So in Piraha, to say we ate most of the fish would be translated literally as my bigness ate at a bigness of fish. Nevertheless, there was a smallness we did not eat. Simpler syntax, but more complicated expression. There's Dan Everett, or the head of Dan Everett, not the whole body. Other apparent complexity trade-offs. Languages like Chinese that have a simple or isolating morphosyntax and individual morphemes that are multiply ambiguous tend to have classifiers, reduplication, compounding, verb serialization, and so on, complex rules of inference, rules interfacing form and meaning. In other words, simple morphosyntax, but complexity elsewhere. There's an important point to make. The existence of trade-offs allows for subparts of grammars to differ in complexity. So Vietnamese has only one inflected form for each of its verbs. Archi, a language of the Caucasus, has over 1,500,000 inflected forms for each of its verbs. Yukhohan, the line is a click, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. A northern Khoisan language has 93 phonemic consonants, while Yimas, a lower Sepik language of Oceania, only has 12 consonants. So individual parts of grammars can certainly differ in complexity. But the question is, are there always complexity trade-offs? Always. Almost surely not. And we'll look at some recent findings on that question later. Okay, universal grammar and equal complexity. In other words, linguistic theory in its various varieties. Some people claim that the nature of grammatical theory itself demands that all languages be equally complex. It's not easy to pin down the origins of this idea. It probably follows naturally, if not logically, from the idea that all languages can be analyzed with the same methodology. Sapir, again, he was adamant as early as 1908 that you could use the same neo-grammarian methods on all languages. Bloomfield also believed the same methods could be used for the analysis and historical reconstruction of all languages. There really aren't many big steps from saying that diachronically all languages can be treated in the same way to saying that synchronically all languages can be treated in the same way, to saying one more step, all languages are equally complex. This is not a logical progression, but it's a reasonable step, each one to take from the step before it. What about generative grammar? Well, in 1968, my PhD advisor, Robert B. Lees, who was Chomsky's first student, by the way, told me, of course, all languages are equally complex. Universal grammar, UG, demands it. This is not obviously true, and it's not clear that Chomsky himself seems to have a definite position on this question. Chomsky in 1959 characterized the grammars of all languages as being essentially comparable, despite the quote-unquote great complexity of each one. In successive quotes that I'm not going to read because they're long and they should be in the written version, Chomsky over the years has sounded more and more like he believes that all languages are equally complex. We have not shown there's diversity of underlying structures. A Martian superorganism would say that all human languages are the same. You all know this if you read Chomsky. This sounds pure Chomsky, right? There's only one human language apart from the lexicon. If there's only one human language, how could you compare languages in terms of relative complexity? So it sounds like Chomsky believes that all languages are equally complex, but he's never precisely asserted that. Given Chomsky's general style, I doubt that he would even consider such an assertion to be intellectually respectable. Nevertheless, Chomsky's closest supporters have not shrunk from making such a claim. A very popular introduction to linguistics by the British and to Chomsky's ideas by the British linguist Neil Smith. Smith wrote, although there are innumerable languages in the world, it is striking that they are all equally complex or simple. This is just a total claim. He doesn't go on to explain it, he claims it. Andrea Moro, an Italian linguist, well, the argument goes, if languages are biologically determined organs like the liver or pancreas, something Chomsky has said many times, and how could they differ in complexity? So in a technical work, Andrea Moro wrote, if we assume biologically determined guidance in language acquisition, we need to assume that languages do not vary in complexity. I am not impressed with these arguments, these theory internal arguments. Now, the next two slides are somewhat technical if you don't do generative grammar, but I'll go through them quickly. Every formal approach allows for peripheral aspects of grammar, such as the P syntax, irregularities of morphology and lexicon, and so on. These could easily differ in complexity from language to language. Even in a principles and parameters approach, some have argued that there can be differences in complexity from one language to another. Some examples: the number of parameter settings needed to fix a language's grammar, if you listen to Mark Baker, or their relative degree of markedness, Lisa Travis and others, can be used to calculate relative complexity. Acquisition hierarchies lead to a concrete measurement of relative complexity of languages. The number of iteration of merge or the nature of interface rules can be used to measure relative complexity. So there's nothing in generative grammar whatever, in my opinion, that says that all languages have to be equally complex. Generative grammar in and of itself is neutral on this question. But at this point in the conversation, Creoles always come up. No discussion of universal grammar and complexity would be adequate without a look at Creole languages. The time-modern position, going back to Schuchart, is that Creoles are simpler than non-Creoles. For Schuchart, Creole structure represented a simpler middle ground between the language of the European plantation owner and that of the people they enslaved. Derek Bickerton, British linguist, tried to give this idea a generative slant by arguing that Creoles manifest the unmarked settings of parameter settings of universal grammar. John McWhorter and others have written that the simplicity of Creoles results from their being young languages. They haven't had time to develop complexity. The debate over Creoles and complexity has become one of the most politically charged issues in linguistics. Accusations of racism, willful misinterpretation of the data. I personally am not a Creolist. I have no stake in this debate. Michel de Graaf from Haiti, in particular, has argued that there is no coherent way that Creoles can be said to be simpler than non-Creoles. He argues that, despite widespread claims, Creoles do not all share common features. The features that Bickerton claims that they share do not look like anybody's theory of UG, and there's no objective way to measure relative complexity anyway, and I'll come back to that very topic in a few minutes. My impression is that the great majority of people who work on Creoles reject the idea that they are simpler in any meaningful way than non-Creoles. And again, I am not a Creolist, and I have no personal argument or stake in this question, but you should all be aware that this is a very, very hot political issue in linguistics. So in summary, so far, the evidence from theoretical linguistics is ambiguous as to whether all languages are equally complex. The idea that language use leads to complexity trade-off seems to be the one to beat if you want to demolish the idea that all languages are equally complex. But now the basic question, how are we going to measure whether languages are equally complex? There's been an entire issue of linguistic vanguard devoted to this question, where different people have different answers, of course. But there's various ways you could go about measuring complexity. Grammar-based, you could measure and compare the degree of complexity of each grammatical component. That's the first thing people think about. But there's user-based complexity. You can measure the complexity from the point of view of the language user. So, first, language acquisition. Do some grammars or parts of grammars take longer for the child to acquire than others? Second, language acquisition. Do some grammars or parts of grammars take longer for the adult learner to acquire than others? Or language use. Are some grammars or parts of grammars more difficult to use than others? Let's start with grammar-based complexity. And again, here we talk about all the work by John McWhorter. He argues that complexity can be measured along 3 dimensions: overspecification, the overt and obligatory marking of semantic distinctions. The more of that, the more complexity. Structural elaboration, the more rules, the more phonemes, the more functional categories, the more complexity. And irregularity, of course, the more irregularity, the more complexity. So by McWhorter's criteria, Estonian is vastly more complex than Saramaccan. Estonian genitive and partitive marking is more semantically overspecified, structurally elaborate, and irregular than Saramaccan, sometimes called a Creole language spoken in South America. Estonian has many more and more irregular morphophonemic processes than Saramaccan. So by McWhorter's criteria, Estonian is more complex, but there have been many, many objections to the idea of measuring complexity by counting parts of grammars. And Michel de Graaf, always the opposition to McWhorter, points out there's no theory behind grammar-based complexity. Advocates write about rules, phonemes, cases, without going below the surface. That is, the units of comparison are descriptive and intuitive terms, not the constructs provided, by formal theory. The assumption guiding the idea that overspecification and structural elaboration makes things more complex seems to be that an obligatory distinction is necessarily more complex than an optional one. But do you really want to assume that? Think about that. Does that make sense? So compare English with Nez Perce, spoken in the northwestern part of the United States. Nez Perce does not distinguish morphosyntactically between modals of possibility and modals of necessity. By McWhorter's criteria, Nez Perce is less complex than English. Does that seem reasonable? Grammar-based complexity approaches presuppose that the more one must convey, the more complex the system. I mean, take this to its logical conclusion. A language with 10,000 ways, one ambiguous lexical item would be the least complex of all. That makes no sense. Also, grammar-based complexity is built on the assumption that complexity is necessarily overt. But certain types of grammars might pose more interpretive challenges than others. And this is the view of, I believe, the Swiss linguist Walter Bisong. Bisong argues that languages such as Chinese and similar languages, they might seem to have a simple grammar, but interpretation is much more difficult. So user-based complexity, first language acquisition. Do some grammars or parts of grammars take longer for the child to acquire than others? Dan Slobin compared children acquiring English, Italian, Serbo-Croatian, and Turkish at 4 age groups. He found the more iconicity, the more rapid the acquisition. Turkish children learn the morphology rapidly, but aspects of the syntax, Turkish morphology is relatively simple to the eye, but aspects of the syntax, like relative clauses, very late. You're familiar with Roman Jakobson, who claimed that there's a universal order of acquisition of elements of phonology provided by markedness theory. Well, if that were true, then we could talk about complexity from that point of view. But others have argued that Jakobson needs to be refined considerably. For example, the sound ch in Quiche, a South American language, is learned very early, but it's learned late in English because it carries a high functional load in Quiche. See, a big problem here is that some elements of grammar are learned late, that is, by children, not because they're necessarily more complex, but because they belong to a stylistic register appropriate to adults or to educated people. So Dabrowska showed that uneducated speakers of Polish and English master a number of constructions much later than educated speakers, or they don't master them at all, not because they're necessarily more complex, but simply because they're part of an adult register. The full Japanese honorific system, which is very complex, is not learned into adulthood. Why? Because it's complex, or because Japanese society works that way? So what about second language acquisition? Do some grammars or parts of grammars take longer for the adult learner? Well, here the problem is you have to abstract away from the degree of similarity of the L1 and the L2. But most work devoted to second language acquisition focuses not on absolute difficulty, but difficulty relative to some particular first language. And there's lots of studies here. So nothing to say more on second language acquisition. Language use, are some grammars or parts of grammars more difficult to use than others? That's not as obviously the case. After all, every existing grammar by definition is usable. It wouldn't be an existing grammar if it were not usable. I'm not sure what it would mean to claim that some grammars are harder to use than others. I suppose it would entail that for some languages, it would take longer for utterances to be expressed or to be understood than other languages. I don't know of any empirical work that would bear this out. I also don't know how you could construct an experiment to demonstrate this. There's long been the idea that certain subparts of grammars pose more processing challenges than others. So the derivational theory of complexity, Chomsky's work back in the 60s, posited the more transformations applying in a derivation, the more difficulty for the user. But this theory implied a particular theory of grammar, early transformational grammar, which has long been abandoned. Nobody thinks that a grammar is a long list of transformations like we did 50 years ago. Other investigators, Jack Hawkins, have related processing difficulty to the size of the recognition domain of the material being processed. The larger the domain, the more processing effort. Hawkins has shown that typologically, constructions that have complex domains are rarer than those that do not, but there's no way to conclude from his work that some languages in their entirety, the entire language, are more complex than others. What about neuroimaging? These techniques might well shed light on relative complexity, but that's still work for the future. Casey and Morrow and Men and Duffield have discussed how difficult it is to determine neurological correlates of grammatical complexity. Again, it's not clear, given our understanding of language in the brain, how we would do this. So, a summary on measuring complexity. Grammar-based complexity is intuitively appealing, but it's riddled with conceptual problems. User-based complexity, well, it's conceptually coherent. We can kind of have an idea of what it means, but it's hardly begun to be developed. So let's look at complexity trade-offs again. Is complexity in one area of the grammar in general compensated for by simplicity in another area? In a nutshell, no, not necessarily. For one thing, why would you believe an old claim, 19th century claim, that rigid word order is as complex as a set of case endings? I don't believe that. Why should anybody believe that? You look at Siewierska's original study, even in her sample of 171 languages, 9 had case marking, but totally rigid word order, and 5 had no case marking, but totally flexible word order. So it doesn't even hold up airtight looking at current languages. Östendal's work in Swedish, there's a regional language of Sweden called Älvdalian. I don't see any trade-offs here, and neither does Dahl. Älvdalian is more complex than standard Swedish by many criteria. The regional language has more sandhi phenomena, stress syllable types, more case, number, person, number distinctions, lexically determined case. Standard Swedish has none of these things. Where are the trade-offs? Why would you want to say that Älvdalian and Swedish, two very, very closely related languages, have the same level of complexity? David Gill, and this is also very controversial, says that Riau Indonesian is simple in every component. There's almost no word internal morphological structure, distinct syntactic categories, or construction-specific rules of interpretation. For example, according to Gill, ayam makan, literally chickens eat, can mean the chicken is eating, the chickens that were eaten, the reasons chicken eat, etc. Gill insists that sentences such as these are vague, not ambiguous. And so Riau does not have more complex rules of semantic interpretation to compensate for its simple morphosyntax. That's quite controversial. And there are scholars who work on Indonesian who say that Gill interprets Riau incorrectly. Again, I am certainly not an expert on Riau Indonesian. However, there's other examples where we don't seem to find trade-offs. Ian Madison on where we do not find trade-offs in phonology. Languages with large consonant inventories tend also to have large vowel inventories. I find that very interesting. Some languages just like to have a lot of everything. Few manner contrasts for stops and bifricatives are not compensated for by more place contrasts. Languages with simpler segmental inventories tend to have less elaborate suprasegmental properties. This is very damning to the idea of trade-offs. To summarize, it's simply not possible to draw any definitive conclusions about the existence of complexity trade-offs, and different researchers have come to different conclusions. Benson all find the trade-off hypothesis is partially supported. Benitez, Buraco, and Chen and Gill found no robust trade-offs. In some languages, there seems to be a positive correlation between complexity and lack of trade-offs. It's very, very complicated. Okay, well, there's other factors, social, historical factors affecting complexity that we should look at next. And last, there's a long tradition that maintains that different types of language contact and different types of language identity will affect language complexity. But here again, there's no consensus at all about precisely how. Here's an old position. Internal language change involves simplification. Contact-induced change involves complication, except for creolization, where pidgin speakers fall back on universal grammar. The idea is if you leave children alone, they'll simplify everything. That's what children do, according to this idea. So English has gradually reduced the number of irregular verbs over the years. Almost all of the irregular verbs that remain in English are high frequency. Word order disharmonies are another good example of contact-induced complication. Amharic, which was originally VO, like most Semitic languages, borrowed OV and generative noun ordering from neighboring Cushitic languages. but they retained prepositions. Ahom, a Thai language, borrowed modifier head order from Assamese or some Tibetan language, maybe Indo-European. So contact, in other words, seems to induce complication. But there are many examples not involving Creoles where language change, language contact has led to simplification. Asia Minor Greek lost theta and ev through merger with T and D and grammatical gender through borrowing from Turkish. Ma'a lost such mark Cushitic features like ejectives, labelized dorsal phonemes, and the singulative number category through borrowing from Bantu. This is work by Thomas and Kaufman. And there's many examples of complication not due to contact. Consider grammaticalization, which can increase the number of categories in a language. That's usually taken as a sign of complexity. English has developed a separate category of modal auxiliaries. Old English did not have that. Romance and Germanic languages have developed new categories of indefinite articles from numerals and definite articles from demonstratives. The best worked out position on social and historical factors is by Peter Trudgill. In a nutshell, little contact, that is isolation, preserves complexity. We've seen that claim. Language variety spoken in close, tight-knit societies tend to develop complexity. Language contact by adults decreases complexity. Language contact by children increases complexity. Okay, and we can find lots of support for these ideas. So Icelandic and Faroese, due to their relative isolation, are more complex than Norwegian, which has experienced more contact, which itself is more complex in many ways than Danish. Though Danish phonology is a nightmare, so he's obviously just talking about Danish syntax. John McWhorter, again, supporting Trudgill, has argued at length that adult contact has led to simplification. As we have seen, he claims that Creoles are simpler than non-Creoles. In his view, English is simpler than other Germanic languages because of Scandinavian contact. So English lost grammatical gender marking on the article, most of case morphology. And McWhorter points to a lot of languages that support contact leading to a decrease in complexity. Mandarin Chinese is simpler than other Chinese languages, less tone because of contact with Altaic. Persian is simpler than other Iranian languages because of Persia's non-Persian subjects trying to learn the language. Colloquial Arabic is simpler than classical due to its spread over non-Arabic speaking areas. Malay Indonesian is simpler than other Austronesian languages due to its use as a lingua franca. He could have talked, or maybe he did somewhere, about Swahili, which is simpler than Bantu languages spoken close by in that it has no tones. Swahili, of course, is a contact language. Note, it's important to point out that VL2 learners don't have to be politically dominant. So Dutch simplified to Afrikaans in South Africa as a result of contact with Bantu and Khoisan speakers, even though it was the Dutch who dominated politically. If Trudgill and McWhorter are right, then why are they right? Adult learners want things to be simple. Kids don't care. Small communities are characterized by more fast speech phenomena, which can lead to more complexity. Small communities develop complex systems in order to be opaque to their neighbors. There's lots of fascinating studies about that. We don't want to talk like those people in the next valley. We don't want them to understand us. Okay, inevitably, Trudgill's and McWhorter's hypotheses are full of problems. Almost every Indo-European language has simplified its inflectional system over the past 2,000 years. Why? Even low contact isolated dialects have done this. Lithuanian is said to be the most conservative Indo-European language, preserving a whole lot of the original Indo-European inflectional and accentual systems, but Lithuanian has hardly been isolated, one of the least isolated languages on earth. It's been in contact with Polish, German, Russian, Swedish, Belarusian, Latvian, and Yiddish throughout history. Very few languages have been as unisolated as Lithuanian, and yet it's very complex by some standards. Actually, look at English. English phonology became considerably more complex as a result of contact with Norman French. English has developed complicated word stress rules, a new voicing opposition, new morphosyntactic alternations, and so on. Is this increase in complexity predicted given the nature of the contact? By Trudgill and McWhorter. Athabascan languages tend to have complex consonant inventories regardless of the degree of contact with other languages. On the other hand, Hay and Bauer found that the more speakers a language has, the bigger its phonemic inventory. But many small isolated languages like Rotakas, Piraha, Hawaiian, and Maori have very small phonemic inventories. At the same time, Quechua, Zulu, Georgian, and Arabic have millions of speakers and large complex phonemic inventories. Lupian and Dale did find an inverse correlation between population size and morphological complexity. Also, when McWhorter and Trudgill write about small or large population size, they equivocate. What do they mean? Do they mean small or large in absolute terms or in relative terms? A language can have only 10,000 speakers, but still be much bigger than its neighbors. Also, many non-Western languages once had many more speakers than today, yet the complexity does not necessarily change as the number of speakers diminishes. Time is running out. I want to leave time for questions. As you can imagine, I've just barely been able to scratch the surface of the factors that might affect complexity and relative complexity. Books and books and books have been written on this topic. An excellent discussion is found in work by Finnish linguist Miastamo. Also for work that deals with complexity in all of its facets, from the influence of climate on vowel systems to the distance of a particular language from Africa, I recommend two volumes, the two volumes of The Adaptive Value of Languages, Non-Linguistic Causes of Linguistic Diversity, edited by Benitez Barraco and Steve Moran. So, if people have heard me give talks before, you all know that I love to have really punchy conclusions, and therefore, this has to be right. Well, my conclusions today are very wishy-washy. Here they are. There's no reason to believe that all languages are equally complex. However, no scale has been devised so far to measure the relative complexity of languages. Also, we all agree social and historical factors are clearly at work in affecting degree of complexity, though precisely how is still a matter of debate. These conclusions are very, very wishy-washy, but I thank you anyway for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer some questions if there's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Newmeyer, for this most comprehensive and enlightening treatment of this admittedly big question in linguistics. I must add that I really like your wishy-washy conclusion, right?
Thank you.
I'm grateful you did not answer the question. because this gives us the floor, right, for your questions here. So, and comments. The floor is open to discussion. We need, what, a second between, yes, between the question and the answer, but yeah. Are there any questions?